Money, money, money. Imagine if this whole video was just me singing ABBA songs. Anyway, one of the most well-known territorial purchases is the Louisiana Purchase, when the then recently established United States bought what today is equivalent to about 1/3 of its territory from France for about $15 million, or their purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire for $7.2 million. The concept of one country buying territory from another is today seen as crazy. In fact, a lot of people joked about it a few years back when there was some talk of the US wanting to buy Greenland off of Denmark. But it's not as crazy or as uncommon as we may think today. I did a video about how the US bought most of its territory, and today I want to expand this to other nations and show you at least some of the countries that have bought territory from each other. I'm going to leave out all of the ones done by the US, since those were covered in the video I just mentioned and whose link you can find in the description below. So let's take a look at a few of the other examples that there are of countries that bought land from other countries. Scotland bought a set of territories off Norway in the year of 1266, the Isle of Man, Ebritz, Kintyre, and the islands of the Firth of Clyde. The transfer took place through the Treaty of Perth in this year of 1266, which ended a military conflict between Magnus VI of Norway and Alexander III of Scotland, precisely over the possession of a few of these islands. This was around the time of Danish and Norwegian expansion into the British Isles. The treaty was agreed 3 years after the Battle of Largs in 1263, where Scotland, despite being outnumbered, defeated the Norwegians, ending over 500 years of Norse Viking raids and invasions. But it's only the Scottish who claimed victory, while the Norwegians at the time claimed the battle was inconclusive, asserting they weren't fully committed to it. Norwegian King Håkon had planned to renew military action the following year, but he died, and his successor, King Magnus VI, sued for peace and secured the Treaty of Perth. In the treaty, Norway recognized Scottish sovereignty over the disputed territories in return for a sum of 4,000 marks and an annuity of 100 marks, which was paid during the following decades. In 1721, Russia bought a gigantic amount of land from Sweden, Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and southeast Finland through the Treaty of Nystad. This was the last peace treaty of the Great Northern War, a conflict in which a coalition led by the Tsardom of Russia successfully contested the supremacy of the Swedish Empire in Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. During the war, Peter I of Russia had occupied all Swedish possessions on the eastern Baltic coast, Swedish Ingria, where he began to build the soon-to-be new Russian capital of St. Petersburg, Swedish Estonia, and Swedish Livonia, and also Finland. So the transfer of these territories was effectively done by conquest, and in the treaty, Swedish King Frederick I merely confirmed it. But he only did so in return for 2 million silver thaler, the Swedish currency at the time. And it's important to note that this purchase, like many of the ones done by the US to Spain for instance, was made in the context of a post-war treaty in which the transfer of territory was made in exchange for money, but the purchase likely wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the war and its specific outcome. About 60 years earlier, in 1662, France bought a chunk of what is today its territory from England, who at the time still had a foothold in continental Europe. These areas were Dunkirk and Fort Mardyk. As opposed to the previous ones which followed a conflict, this was effectively a sale. It took place when Charles II of England sold his sovereign rights to Dunkirk and Fort Mardyk to his cousin Louis XIV of France. The reason for the sale was apparently the fact that the English king was literally short on money and concerned that Dunkirk was a potential liability for international relations, so he sold it to France. The purchase price was 5 million livres, a French medieval currency, and many in England opposed the sale. Another territorial purchase in Europe took place between two countries that technically no longer exist, at least in their form at the time. In 1865, Prussia bought Saxe-Lauenburg from Habsburg, Austria. This sale took place at the Gastein Convention a treaty concerning precisely the governing of the Elbe duchies of Schleswig, Holstein, and Saxe-Lauenburg. It seems these territories were previously under the rule of the Danish, but also a part of the Holy Roman Empire and then the German Confederation. The mixed ruling was always an issue, and when the Danish attempted to fully rule it in 1858, the Germans protested and went to war. They were victorious in what was known as the Second Schleswig War, and the following treaty declared that the Elbe duchies were to be ceded to the victorious Prussia and Austria. The Prussians wanted to annex them, the Austrians wanted to rule them together, so they negotiated. The administration of the territories was split between them. Prussia would rule over Schleswig and Austria over Holstein. Austria would officially renounce Saxe-Lauenburg, which would be ruled by the Prussian king, for a purchase of 2.5 million Danish rigsdaler. A lot of these events of countries buying land off each other took place in the context of European nations colonizing Africa and America. One example is the British purchase of both the Dutch and Danish Gold Coast territories. The Danish Gold Coast was bought by the British in 1850 for a mere £10,000. I couldn't find out why or how, but I believe it followed a conflict between the two, as the territories had previously been occupied by Portugal, Britain's allies, and Britain itself. While the purchase of the Dutch Gold Coast took place in 1870-71 through a set of treaties meant to resolve a number of colonial disputes between the two nations. Essentially, they sold them this one while the British ceded territories elsewhere. The price agreed upon was of 49,939.62 cents of Dutch guilders, the currency of the Netherlands, through the 15th century until 2002, when it was replaced by the euro. Another colonial example, this time in the Pacific, was the German purchase of Spanish Caroline Islands, Palau, and Mariana Islands. This took place in 1899 for 25 million pesetas, equivalent to 17 million German marks. Spain had recently lost the Spanish-American War, in which it lost or was forced to sell a number of its colonies, namely in the Pacific, some of which they had already begun to lose earlier due to independence movements. And here it lost all of the remainder once, but not through war, through trade. The German-Spanish treaty saw the Caroline Islands and the Northern Mariana Islands, as well as Palau, which at the time was seen as part of the Carolines, transferred onto German ownership. One purchase that, for a change, didn't involve European nations was the purchase of the city of Gwadar by Pakistan from the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman. Gwadar is a port city on the southwestern Arabian Sea coastline. In 1783, the Khan of Kalat granted sovereignty over Gwadar to Taimur Sultan, the then defeated ruler of Muscat. When the Sultan subsequently retook Muscat, he continued his rule in Gwadar by appointing a local governor. The territory was under Muscat/Oman control up to 1958, when Pakistan purchased it from them for 5,500 million Pakistan rupees. And going back to Europe, one of the most recent territorial purchases took place just after World War II, when West Germany bought Elten, Selfkant, and Suderwijk from the Netherlands in 1963 for 280 million German marks. At the end of World War II, plans were made in the Netherlands to annex German territory as compensation for the damages caused by the war. Most of these plans did not come to be implemented. That would be a good topic for a video. Post-war plans that were never followed, but while not all of the areas were annexed, a few of them were, temporarily. And in 1957, West Germany negotiated the return of them, with the Netherlands paying 280 million German marks for the return of Elten, Selfkant, and Suderwijk as Wiedergutmachung, perfect German, I know, essentially a term for war reparations. So, those were a few of the most iconic or important territorial purchases between countries throughout history, save the ones done by the United States, which, like I mentioned, are in their own video. It's really impressive how you come to the conclusion that the United States effectively bought most of the territory they have today, even though some were in the context of wars or followed their victories in wars. But worldwide there are a few more, like the purchase of Singapore by the United Kingdom from Johor, or the purchase of Saccal by Denmark from France, among a few others. If you really like this video, I can always do a part 2 where I look at those in more detail, and also let me know in the comments if there are any significant territorial purchases that I missed. Thanks so much for watching, subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.